Okay, so in this video, I'm going to go over one of the four main things that you're going to need to know to create classes, right? First of all, I'm going to go over instance variables. I'm going to go over properties. I'm going to go over methods, and I'm going to also go over uh, creating your own constructors. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started. Okay, so here I have a class. It's called student. So the first thing I want to think about is what type of attributes would a student have? They'd have things like name, maybe ID number, um, age, different things like that. So for this example, I'm going to define two private instance variables for student. I'm going to define, I'm going to create the a string for their name, and I'm also going to create an age variable, which would be an integer. Right, so to define the instance variables, start at the beginning here. First of all, we set them to private because we don't want these variables to be accessible to our test application. Right, so we set it to private, and we define the data type. So this will be the name. So this would be string, and we can just we'll call it name, but keep in mind that the instance variables always start out with a lowercase letter, right? Okay, so then the other attribute for a student would be their age, so that would be private, int for integer, and then age, and then age is also lowercase, right? So we keep that in mind, and it's also set to private. Okay, so now that we have our instance variables, next we're going to create two properties that can be used by the test application. These properties will be public, and they can be used to set and get the values from either name or age, right? So we need to define two of them. So let's start with name first. Okay, so to define a property that's going to be public, the return type, which for name is string, and the property name, which by convention is the same as the instance variable. The only difference is that it's uppercase. And since it's not a method, it does not take a set of parentheses, so it doesn't have that. So don't make sure not to put those in there because it doesn't take any arguments. And then put your curly brackets, curly braces. Okay, so that's the name property, and then inside the name property we have two accessors. We have the get and we have the set, right? So for get, you type get, and then another set of a left brace and a right brace, and then we have a set also with its own set of braces. Right? And then you can put some space in here. But the reason we have an error is because we need to define the code that goes inside the get block. This is the block here. So the code that goes here, whenever this property is called in the test application, which we haven't created a file for it yet, but we will. Whenever name is called, the name property, it needs to return the value that's stored in the instance variable, the one that's stored here. So then we need to return, and here it's the lowercase name, right? Because we're referring to this guy here. And then for set, what we're going to do is whenever whenever the name property is called, we need to set the value for the private variable. All right, so then what it would be, what you would type is name, lowercase, equals, and then use the keyword value. All right, so whatever the user assigns to the name, the property name, that value will go inside the private variable here. All right, so this is what this statement means, and I'll show you how it works once we get to the test application. But that's how you define a property. But this property is only for name. Next, we need a property for age as well. All right, so it's going to be the same process again. All right, so it's going to be public int and then uppercase age, curly braces, get another set of braces, put some space if you want, then set, then another set of braces here. All right, so you can kind of see the pattern, and I always make sure to type these in their in pairs because they always come together. That way you don't forget one. All right, so whenever we call the age property, we're going to return the private instance variable called age, which is lowercase. All right, so this guy refers to this guy here. Then whenever we assign a value from the test application to the property, then we set age, the private instance variable, we set it to the value that the user types. Okay. But let's just say, for instance, when the age property is called, the user types a negative number, right? So let's say they try to assign a -1. In that case, we have no way of controlling that. So the -1 would be assigned to the student age, and that wouldn't make any sense because there's no such thing as a person or a student or anyone else being age of -1 or -10, right? So we don't want any negative numbers. So that's what the property is for. The property can control the values that are assigned to the private variables, and that's why we make them private, because we don't want the user just to assign anything to this variable here. We want to be able to control the value and set it ourselves, or I'm sorry, set it correctly. So what we can do is we can delete this real quick, and we can use an if statement. So if the value the user types is less than 0, then we'll set the private variable to maybe 1 years old, let's just say. Else, see, there's no other condition. Either the value is less than 0 or it's greater than 0, right? So if the value is greater than 0, then we can simply set the age to whatever the user types, right? Because in that case, the value might be correct. Of course, maybe you might want to develop a range, right? We don't want any students that are older than 100 years old or 200 years old. So you can also control that as well, right, to set it some sort of age. But in this case, we'll just keep it kind of simple. So if the value the user in the test application assigns is less than 0, then we'll just set the age to 1 automatically. Else, if they put a 0 or anything greater, then we'll take the value that they assign. So that's one way of controlling controlling the numbers that are used for the instance variables here. So that's the whole point of the property, right? That's why we define them. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to go over are the methods. All right, so we're going to define one method for student. This method will just display maybe their name and their age. All right, so to do that, we have to make that method public. The return type in this case, we're just going to print out some statements to the screen, so we don't really need to return anything. There's no calculations being done or anything like that. So for our return type, we can simply use void, and we can call it something like display message. And since a method can take a set of parameters, it can take some arguments, we have to put the parentheses. But in this case, even though we're not going to actually take any sort of input for this method, we can leave the parentheses empty for now. Right, and then we want to display the name for the student and their age. Right, so we can do that using maybe one or two console.writeLine statements. So console.write line, and then our string, it could be something like student name colon a placeholder, and then in this placeholder we will call, since we have a property, we have a get for name, we'll use the uppercase name here. Yeah, so whenever we try to either get the value or when we try to set the value, we always go through the property. We don't directly access the variable name here. Okay, so that's for the student age. Then console.write line, and then maybe something like student age, and then another placeholder, and then here again we call the property, not the instance variable, so we use the uppercase one. So that's our display message method. Now the last thing we need is going to be the constructor that we're going to use to initialize the values for each instance of student. Each object that we create of the student class, we want to set the values through the constructor. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, so first of all, the constructor is public, and since student is neither a method or a property, it does not have a return type. Also, the other thing about the constructor is that it has to be the exact same name as the class. That's the only way the application or C# knows that we're trying to define a constructor, right? It's the only sort of method, construct, if you will, that has the same name as the class, right? So you could just call it student. It does, however, take arguments, because those arguments we're going to use to initialize our student object, right? So in this case, we have two properties that we can use to set the values for student. So we're going to define those in a parameter list after the inside the parentheses, right? So first of all, we have string name, and then we have int age, and then we also have a set of braces. Okay, so in the display message method, we called the property, and then the property goes to the get method, or let's say like for age, it goes to the get and it returns the age, or returns a value that's stored in the instance variable. But in the constructor, we need to initialize it, so we need to set the values for name and age. So when we type name equals lowercase name, then here we're calling the property, but this time we're calling the set accessor, right? Because we're using the equal sign. And then this name here is this name coming into the student constructor as an argument or as a parameter, right? This value here is local only to the constructor. This value has nothing to do with the instance variable up here. If you want to, what you can do instead, maybe to make this a little easier to read, and that way you don't confuse this parameter with the instance variable, what we can do is just simply maybe use the first letter and age, and then maybe A, and then we set this guy here, we set it to N. So string N is going to represent the value coming from the test application, and that value is going to be assigned to the property, and then from the property here, whatever value is being sent to it will be assigned to the private instance variable from here. Right, so now we can do the same thing for age. Remember, this is uppercase age, this is the property, and then we're going to set its value to the letter A, which is the parameter from here. Right, so if you highlight this, it highlights this value here to show you that that's a parameter, right? So you even put your cursor on it, and the parameters are whatever's in the parentheses, and it's not what's in the private instance variables. Okay, so yeah, that's quite a bit of information, and without actually testing it out, it's kind of a little bit difficult to follow along if it's your first time working with classes and objects, right? So once we create the student test app, or the student test file, this should hopefully come a little bit more together. Okay, so now let's create the student test file. All right, so you go here, right click, add new item, code file, and then we're going to call this student test, then add. All right, so now we have two files, right? We already defined our class, now we're going to test it out. Here we can use using system, and then define the class, public class, and then this time this is student test. And our test application needs the main method because that's the entry point to our application. So that's public static void main string args. Okay. Okay, so in our test application, what we're going to do is first create an object of student class, and then we're going to display the values that are stored into that object, right? So first of all, let's go ahead and call the constructor for student, let's create an object. So just create an object. Let me type it here. See, create an object of student, or uppercase student. Okay, so let's do that first. So to do that, first we use the class name, so student. Then we use a name. This is the name of the object. We can name it whatever we want. So it could be obj for object, obj student 1, right? So the first student. And then we invoke the constructor. So new. Then remember the constructor has the same name as the class, so student. And then if I open the parentheses, then we get a little tip here from IntelliSense of what values to assign. Right, so string n, which we remember would be for the name, and int a would be for the age. Right, so then it's a string for n for name. So I'm going to put a name in there, Nick Hinojosa. Right, and then it's separated by a comma, and then I'm going to set Nick Hinojosa's age, and I'm going to set it to -10. All right, so we'll see what happens when we do that. Then close your parentheses and then your semicolon. Right, so now we've created an object called student1, and we assign the values of Nick Hinojosa, and we set his age to -10. Now here I'm going to display the values assigned to the object. Okay, so then I have a method already that I defined called display message that will already show me these values. Right, so we can call that method by typing the object name first, obj student 1, and then we use the access member operator dot, and then we have either the properties showing up here. Here's some other methods. The method we want is the one we defined earlier called display message here, and since the method, always remember to include the parentheses. In this case, the parentheses are empty. There's no parameters, unlike the constructor where we define 2 parameters. Right, so then that's it. Now I should display the information that was assigned to obj student 1. So then control F5. See, and the student name is Nick Hinojosa, and then the age, because -10 was not valid, the property ended up putting a 1 in there instead. Okay, so the next thing we'll do is we'll use the properties now, and we'll change the values that were assigned originally in the constructor for obj student 1. So go ahead and close this out, and then we'll continue. So let's change the values assigned to obj student 1 using the properties. Alright, so maybe we can fix this -10 here. Alright, so then you call the object, or you type the object name, obj1 dot. We can change the name, and we can use the equal sign, which we'll call the set accessor in the property, and we can set it to a different name. So I prefer my full name, which is Nicholas Hinojosa, and semicolon. So now we've used the property to change my name. Next, I need to fix my age. All right, so again, obj student 1 dot age, and this time I'm going to set it to my real age, which is 32. Now I'm going to display the new values. All right, so again, I will call the display message method, and then we'll see what happens. So control F5. Right, so here these first two lines are coming from this display message. Then I change the values, so then this second set of statements now reflect the changes I made through the properties. So I hope this kind of helps put everything kind of together for you.